The
Oh
snowstorm
dear,
came in
don't
fast and
strain
without
yourself.
mercy, the
We
kind
might
that
miss our
swallowed
flight while
Colorado
you
mountains
struggle
whole
with the
and
shovel.
erased the boundary between sky and earth.
Visibility
Until a
is
pilot
dropping
could no
below
longer tell
minimums
where
on
the
runway
clouds ended
29er.
and the
All
peaks
ground
began.
operations must cease
Inside the sleek
immediately.
private jet
I repeat,
knifing
clear
through
the runway.
turbulence at 11,000
The weather's
feet,
closing in.
Victoria
The
Lang
helicopter
gripped
won't
the
wait
leather
much longer.
armrest with one hand
I understand the
and
risks,
pressed the other flat
but I need
against
confirmation
the cool oval
first.
window, as though she could read the weather through the glass. She was not afraid of flying. She had logged more air miles in the past decade than most people accumulate in a lifetime, had sat through equipment malfunctions and emergency diversions, and one truly terrifying departure out of Dubai in a sandstorm that had made even the flight crew sweat and grip their armrests while she had calmly reviewed quarterly projections. Turbulence did not impress her. Weather did not impress her. What the world outside the window could do to a schedule, that was another matter entirely. What made her jaw tighten now, what made her check her watch for the third time in 20 minutes, was the thought of being late. The merger meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning at the Aspen Grand, and the contract sitting in her attaché case represented $340 million in aerospace technology rights, her company's largest acquisition in 11 years of operation. She had not clawed her way to the top of Langtech Aviation Group by tolerating delays, and she was not about to start now. But the storm had different plans. The pilot's voice crackled through the cabin intercom. Calm and professional. The voice of a man accustomed to delivering bad news without drama. They were being redirected. Weather conditions at the Aspen Regional Airport had deteriorated beyond safe approach parameters. There was a small private airfield 40 miles northeast, a place called Reed Mountain Airfield, that was still reporting manageable visibility and a cleared runway. They would land there, wait out the worst of it, and reassess in the morning. Victoria exhaled slowly through her nose and said nothing. The three senior directors seated across from her exchanged careful glances, the way people do when they work for someone whose silence is more dangerous than their words. Reed Mountain Airfield appeared beneath them as a scattering of lights in an ocean of white. A few hangar shapes, a single runway bordered by amber lights half buried in snowdrift, a small terminal building that looked like it had been built sometime during the administration of a president nobody under 40 would remember. As the jet descended through swirling snow and touched down with a firm, practiced bump, Victoria pressed her face briefly to the window and surveyed what she had landed in. The runway was short but clear. The hangars were old corrugated metal painted a faded red that the years had softened to something closer to rust. One small prop plane sat outside with a blue tarpaulin strapped over its engine cowling. Parked near the far end of the main hangar, looking as though it had been assembled from parts salvaged across several different decades, sat a helicopter. It was an old Bell model, the kind that Vietnam War documentaries used as establishing shots. Its green paint worn through to bare metal in patches along the tail boom, its rotor blades tied down against the wind with thick nylon rope. Someone had written something in black marker along the fuselage. Letters faded to near illegibility, the kind of personal inscription that working aircraft accumulate the way sailors used to carve initials into their bunks. Victoria stared at it for a long moment before she reached for her coat. "That thing," she said to no one in particular, just loudly enough for her directors to hear, "belongs in a museum." The directors laughed, the way people laugh when the most powerful person in the room says something. Because the laughter costs nothing, and the silence might cost everything. The terminal building was small and warm, in the way that old buildings sometimes are not elegant warmth, not the engineered climate of a glass and steel corporate lobby, but the dense settled heat of a place that had been sheltering people from mountain winters for half a century. The walls were paneled in pine, darkened with age, hung with framed photographs of aircraft that spanned what appeared to be the entire history of mountain aviation biplanes, wartime transports, early jet trainers, crop dusters, search and rescue configurations, each photo labeled in careful handwriting with a date and a location, and sometimes a name. A coffee machine older than most of the Langtech junior staff sat on a counter beside a rack of folded aviation charts. 2 rows of vinyl seats, cracked but clean, ran along one wall beneath a long window that looked out onto the runway apron. A mounted elk head observed everything from above the doorway, with the particular wisdom that comes from having no remaining opinions. Victoria swept through the terminal, with her directors trailing behind her like planets, orbiting a fast-moving star. She had already assessed the situation and found it inadequate. There was no concierge. There was no business lounge. The Wi-Fi password, handwritten on a strip of masking tape and stuck to the counter, connected at speeds that would have embarrassed the year 2000. She set her attaché case on the counter, opened her laptop, and began composing an email to her legal team, because a storm might stop a jet, but it was not going to stop her from working. Behind her, one of the directors murmured something to another about the photographs on the wall. She did not look up. Outside on the apron, partially obscured by the angled snowfall, a man was moving along the edge of the runway with a long-handled push broom. He swept in long, methodical strokes, clearing the area around the tie-down anchors and the base of the fuel pump. Working without hurry and without waste, each stroke exactly as wide as it needed to be. He wore a heavy canvas work jacket, the color of old military equipment, not camouflage exactly, just the kind of faded olive drab that comes from years of washing and sun and outdoor work. His boots were thick-soled, already whitened at the toe with packed snow. His face, when he turned briefly into the light from the terminal windows, was weathered in the way that faces get when they have spent many decades outdoors in high altitude, lined deeply around the eyes, brown from the sun even in winter, calm in the particular way of someone who has made his peace with weather and no longer treats it as a personal inconvenience. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-60s, maybe older. It was hard to say. He had one of those faces that had finished aging some years ago and simply settled into itself. The way good timber does, hardening past a point where further weathering leaves little mark. He swept steadily and paid no attention to the jet or to the people now moving around inside the terminal. He did not look up when they arrived. He did not look up when the jet engines wound down. He swept his section, moved to the next, and worked as though the storm and the strange aircraft and the expensive visitors were simply weather to be accounted for and moved past. Victoria needed to know whether there was a lounge, a private room, a conference space, anything more suitable than vinyl chairs and an elk head. She pushed open the glass door to the apron, and the cold hit her like something physical. A wall of wind-driven snow that made her eyes water instantly. The man with the broom was closer than she had realized, maybe 15 feet away, still working. "Excuse me," she said, using the tone she used with service staff and contractors, which was not unkind exactly, but contained within it the clear assumption that the person being addressed existed primarily to answer her question. The man stopped sweeping and looked at her. His eyes were a calm, dark gray, the color of clouds before rain. "Is there a private meeting room in this building? Or a lounge of some kind?" He considered this for a moment, not as if he were slow, but as if he believed that questions deserved actual consideration before answering. "Back corridor, past the chart room, there's a conference space," he said. His voice was low and even, with a flatness that belonged to no particular region, the accent worn smooth by time, or travel, or both. "It's not fancy, but it's got a table and heat." Victoria nodded. She had already dismissed him in her mind, and was turning back toward the door when she noticed he was looking past her toward the runway where her jet sat, and then toward the old helicopter at the far end of the hangar. He was reading the situation the way experienced people read weather. Quickly, quietly, without announcement. "Does that thing actually fly?" she asked, nodding toward the bell. It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of remark people make when they want to confirm that what they find laughable is indeed worth laughing at. The man looked at the helicopter and then back at her. "It still does its job," he said simply. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a dismissal, but was both, and went back inside. The conference room was, as the man had said, not fancy. A rectangular table of solid pine, 8 chairs around it, a whiteboard on one wall with old marker stains that the eraser had failed to fully remove. A small window looked out toward the northern end of the airfield, where the approach lights were barely visible through the thickening snowfall. But the heat worked, and Victoria set up her laptop and her documents, and her directors settled in around her And they worked, because that was what she did. That was what she had always done, and she was not going to let a snowstorm and a provincial airfield and an old man with a broom disrupt the rhythm that had built her company from a two-person consultancy in a rented office to a multi-billion-dollar force in aerospace technology. Over the next hour and a half, as snow continued to pile against the windows and the wind picked up outside, Victoria and her team reviewed the acquisition terms, refined their negotiating positions, and drafted 2 sets of counterproposals. The kind of work that required concentration and fluency, and the ability to hold multiple competing interests in the mind at once. Victoria was good at this. She had always been good at this. Occasionally, she heard sounds from outside the rumble of diesel engines, voices calling instructions through the wind, the muffled grinding of heavy equipment, but she paid no attention. That was someone else's world. She had her own. During a break, one of her directors, Marcus, the youngest of the 3, the one most likely to notice things that the others had already learned to overlook, wandered to the window and looked out at the apron. The snowplows were running now, clearing the taxiway in wide, deliberate arcs, their amber warning lights blinking steadily through the snow. He watched for a moment and then said, without turning around, "That janitor is out there talking to the plow operators." Victoria did not look up from her document. "So?" Marcus hesitated. "He's not talking to them like a janitor. He's giving them instructions. And they're doing exactly what he says." Victoria typed another line and then another. Everyone gives instructions to someone. She closed that subject in the way she closed most things she had decided were not relevant cleanly, without argument, by simply not continuing. Marcus took his seat again and said nothing more, because in Victoria's world, the people who worked at places like this were interchangeable and peripheral. Fixtures of the environment rather than participants in it, and she had too much on her mind to care about the organizational dynamics of a mountain airfield that she would be leaving as soon as the weather permitted. She returned to the counterproposals. The wind rattled the window frame. Outside, the man in the olive jacket kept moving between the vehicles and the personnel with the unhurried precision of someone following a plan that existed entirely in his head. Later, when Victoria stepped out to the narrow hallway to take a call from her legal team in New York, she passed the small operations desk where a junior staff member was watching a weather feed on a monitor. The display showed a radar image of the storm system, a vast spiral of white covering most of the western slope, with the airfield's position marked at its approximate center. The young man at the desk was on a phone, speaking quietly and making notes on a pad. He did not look up when she passed, because his attention was entirely on the screen and on whatever information was coming through the line, and his expression had the specific quality of someone who understands that the information they are receiving is serious. Victoria noted this the way she noted most things accurately, without assigning it weight. She took her call. The legal team had questions about 2 of the indemnification clauses. She answered them without consulting her documents, because she had memorized the documents, because that was the kind of thing she did. By the time she returned to the conference room, the wind had increased again, and the snow against the window was no longer falling so much as being driven horizontally, and the diesel sound of the equipment outside had changed pitch and frequency in a way that suggested more machinery had been deployed. She noticed this and noted it, and returned her attention to the counterproposals, because that was where her attention belonged. She was very good at keeping her attention where it belonged. It was, she would later think, both her greatest professional asset and, occasionally, her most significant limitation. But the weather did not permit. By 10 o'clock that night, the storm had surpassed every forecast model by a significant margin. The National Weather Service upgraded the system from a winter storm warning to a blizzard warning, and the wind chill at the summit stations north of the airfield dropped to temperatures that cracked equipment and froze moisture in fuel lines. The visibility on the runway dropped to near zero. 3 of the airfield's navigation lights on the northern approach lost power when ice accumulated on an exposed electrical junction and the connector failed under the load. Victoria learned all of this from her pilot, who came to the conference room door with the carefully neutral expression of a man delivering news that he knows will be received badly. She listened in silence. When he was finished, she asked when the earliest possible departure window was. He said perhaps morning, perhaps later. He said the word perhaps in the careful way of someone who means probably not. Victoria stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world was white and howling, and entirely indifferent to $340 million. She needed to speak to whoever was in charge of this facility. She needed to understand exactly what resources were available, what the realistic timeline looked like, and whether there was any option at all, that could get her team to Aspen before 9 in the morning. One of the Airfield staff, a young woman in a red fleece who had appeared at some point to check on the terminal guests, told Victoria that the Airfield manager was currently out on the runway working on the navigation light system. Victoria asked for his name. The young woman said it was Mr. Reed. Victoria went to the window again and looked out. The apron lights cast long pale cones through the driving snow, and, in one of those cones, she could make out a cluster of figures working around a light pole near the northern end of the runway. A maintenance truck parked at an angle, its hazard lights cutting orange and white through the blizzard. Two workers in high-visibility vests crouched at the base of the pole, and at the center of the activity, directing it with clear and unhurried authority, the man in the olive canvas jacket. The man with the broom. He was not holding the broom now. He was holding a radio in one hand and a flashlight in the other, and he was pointing at something on the electrical panel that one of the workers had opened, and the workers were listening to him with the focused attention of people who understand that the person speaking knows exactly what he is talking about, not because he had told them he knew, because he had shown them, over time, by being right. Victoria watched this for longer than she intended to. There was something in the quality of the attention the workers were giving him, not deference to a title or a uniform or a company vehicle, but the straightforward trust of people who have worked alongside someone long enough to know that when he speaks, things go right. Within 22 minutes, the navigation lights came back on. The whole northern approach lit up in a clean chain of amber and white against the black sky. And she heard from inside the building a small cheer from somewhere near the operations desk, a spontaneous sound. The sound of relief. The young woman in the red fleece came back to the conference room with fresh coffee and the information that the runway was fully operational again. Victoria asked, as neutrally as she could manage, about the man in the jacket. Just background, she said, just trying to understand who she would be working with through the night. The young woman's name was Kara, and she was 23 years old and had worked at Reed Mountain for 2 years, and she spoke about Samuel Reed with the unguarded pride of someone who has never learned to be strategic about admiration. She told Victoria that Samuel Reed had served as a military aviator for 22 years, flying transport missions out of bases in Germany and later Japan, and then search and rescue operations in Alaska in conditions that would have grounded most civilian pilots, whiteout landings, night rescues off mountain ridgelines, hoisting operations in winds that could snap a cable. That after he retired from service, he had spent the next decade building a small regional air transport company from nothing, hauling cargo and mail and medical supplies to mountain communities that the larger carriers couldn't be bothered to serve, flying routes that were unprofitable by every metric except the one that counted most to the people waiting on the ground. That there were families in 3 different valleys who had received medical shipments and emergency equipment in the middle of winters when no road access existed, and who had never met Samuel Reed and did not know his name, but who were alive or healthy because of decisions he had made at cost to himself. Kara said this last part not as a dramatic statement but as a plain fact, the way young people speak about things they have grown up understanding to be simply true. That he had bought Reed Mountain Airfield 15 years ago when the previous owner went bankrupt and the county was looking at converting the land to other uses, which would have meant the end of reliable air access for 3 towns in the valley below. That his acquisition of the airfield had, in the view of everyone who lived and worked in those 3 towns, prevented an economic unraveling that some people believed would have taken a generation to recover from the kind of slow collapse that happens when a community loses its connection to the larger world, when businesses close and young people leave, and the infrastructure that everybody took for granted turns out to have been held together by things that nobody thought to protect until they were gone. That the land surrounding the airfield, the 4,000 acres of mountain terrain that contained the approach corridors, the emergency landing zones, the fuel storage infrastructure, the access roads was his, purchased over many years, piece by piece, with the patience of someone who understood that real things take time and that the value of land is not always visible in the present moment. Victoria listened to all of this with the stillness of a person who has just learned something that reorganizes several other things simultaneously. When Kara finished and left with the coffee tray, the conference room was very quiet. Marcus was looking at his laptop screen with an expression suggesting he was not reading what was on it. The other two directors were looking at nothing in particular. Victoria looked at her reflection in the dark window glass and thought, with the uncomfortable precision that she was capable of when she chose to apply it to herself, about the word that had come to her mind when she first saw the old helicopter. Museum. She sat with that word for a while. It was not a comfortable word to sit with. Just before midnight, a call came in over the airfield's emergency frequency that changed the atmosphere of the entire building. A medical transport aircraft, a twin-engine turboprop that had taken off from Grand Junction 3 hours earlier, carrying a shipment of surgical equipment and blood products for a hospital in Steamboat Springs, encountered severe icing conditions on the climb and declared an OSSO emergency. The desing system had partially failed. The pilot was requesting an immediate diversion to the nearest available runway. Reed Mountain was the nearest available runway. The problem was the crosswind. The storm had shifted in the last hour, and the wind was now coming in at an angle that made the runway dangerous for a fully loaded turboprop in low visibility. Not impossible. But the margin was narrow enough that a single mistake in the approach corridor could put a damaged aircraft into the terrain on either side of the runway threshold. Dangerous but not impossible if the approach lighting was perfect. If the runway surface was exactly right, if someone on the ground who knew what they were doing was guiding the crew in with accurate real-time conditions, reporting from a position that the instruments couldn't provide. Samuel Reed was on the radio within 40 seconds of the initial distress call. Victoria heard him through the operations room door, which had been left open, and she heard in his voice something she recognized from the best leaders she had known across her career. Not urgency in the frantic sense, not excitement, but a concentration so complete and so calm that it seemed to pull the anxiety out of the room, the way a fire draws oxygen to itself. Everyone in the terminal went quiet. He was already moving while he was still talking. He sent 2 vehicles to the runway, with cones and supplementary portable lights. He coordinated with the maintenance crew on runway surface conditions, getting precise measurements of the friction coefficient at 3 different points along the pavement. He got on the radio with the distressed pilot and spent 7 minutes talking through the approach, asking precise questions about fuel state and aircraft performance, giving precise information about wind direction and speed and the exact position of the supplementary lights, adjusting the guidance as the aircraft's situation evolved in real time. And then, when he had prepared everything on the ground as well as it could be prepared, he went to the old helicopter. Not because anyone told him to. Not because a protocol required it. Because there was a patch of dead space in the radar coverage on the final approach where the aircraft would be temporarily blind to ground control, a gap of about 400 feet, where the turboprop would be descending through terrain-induced interference with no electronic guidance, and a helicopter, positioned at the right point along the approach corridor, could provide eyes-on guidance and serve as a visible reference point for the descending pilot. He was airborne in under 4 minutes. Victoria stood at the terminal window and watched the old Bell lift off into the blizzard, its running lights swallowed almost immediately by the snow, becoming 2 small colored points of light that blinked and disappeared, and she felt something that was not a feeling she was accustomed to, a kind of smallness. Not the humiliating smallness of being made to feel insignificant, but the clarifying smallness of standing near something genuinely large. 26 minutes later, the medical transport touched down hard, but safely on runway 27. Its main gear hitting the pavement with a crack that was audible inside the terminal. The people in the operations room exhaled in a collective release of breath that they had apparently been holding together. The helicopter returned 8 minutes after that, settling onto the apron with the particular deliberateness of a pilot who respects weather and does not perform for audiences. Victoria was standing outside when Samuel Reed climbed down from the helicopter. The cold was severe, and the snow was still falling. Though more lightly now, he had a ground crew waiting. And he spoke to them briefly, his breath making clouds in the frigid air, checking on the status of the medical transport crew, confirming that the runway was being cleared again for any further operations, passing the radio to one of the operations staff with a quiet instruction she couldn't hear from where she stood. She had been standing in the cold for several minutes, without entirely deciding why. He noticed her when he turned from the ground crew. He stopped, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the falling snow. He was not surprised to see her. He did not look triumphant, or vindicated, or anything that she might have expected from a man who had been laughed at by strangers and had just demonstrated, comprehensively and without any apparent intention to demonstrate anything, exactly who he was. He looked tired in the way of someone who has been working hard for many hours and knows there are more hours still to come. "Your team doing all right?" he asked. It was such a plain question, such an ordinary question, as though the appropriate response to having just guided a damaged aircraft through a blizzard was to check on the comfort of the guests. Victoria found, for the first time in a professional context that she could remember, that she did not have an immediate response. "We're fine," she said. "Thanks to you." He shook his head slightly. "Thanks to the ground crew. Thanks to the maintenance team that got those lights back up. Thanks to the pilot who flew that transport. He did the hard part." She looked at him for a long moment. The snow was catching in the gray of his hair. "I said something earlier," she said. "About your helicopter." He waited without moving, without shifting his weight, without any of the small fidgeting adjustments that most people make when they sense something uncomfortable approaching. "It was disrespectful," she said, "and it was stupid. I was looking at the paint and the age, and I made a judgment that I had no basis for. And I was wrong." Samuel Reed looked at the helicopter, now being covered again by the ground crew with a tarpaulin against the continued snowfall. "I've had that aircraft for 31 years, he said. "She's carried rescue workers into flood zones when the roads were gone. She's lifted injured climbers off ridgelines in the dark when no fixed-wing aircraft could safely operate in that terrain. She's delivered medicine to communities that roads couldn't reach in winter." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the tarpaulin settling over the old fuselage, with the familiarity of a man looking at something he knows completely. "The paint doesn't have much to do with any of that." Victoria nodded. The cold was significant now, working its way through her coat, but she did not move toward the door. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "How long have you owned this airfield?" 15 years come March, he said. "And the surrounding land?" He looked at her steadily. "Long enough." There was no satisfaction in his voice. No quiet pleasure in the revelation. "No. I told you so," wrapped in polite packaging. Just the plainness of a fact being stated by someone who does not need it to mean anything beyond itself. This, Victoria thought, standing in the cold outside a wind-scoured mountain airfield in the middle of a blizzard, was what genuine confidence actually looked like. Not the performed confidence of boardrooms, not the aggressive assurance of people who need others to feel small in order to feel large. Just the simple, undemonstrative sureness of someone who knows what they have built and does not require it to be admired. The storm began losing energy around 4 in the morning. The way mountain storms sometimes do not gradually but in stages, the wind dropping in intervals, the snow thinning to scattered flakes, the clouds beginning to break apart on the western edge and let through, by 5 o'clock, the first cold gray light of a winter dawn. Victoria had not slept. She had worked through the night in the conference room, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, she had set aside the acquisition documents and spent an hour doing something she had not done in a long time, which was thinking not strategically, not tactically, but openly and without an agenda about the way she moved through the world and what she assumed about it, and what those assumptions cost her, and what they might cost others. She thought about the people in the operations room who had cheered when the navigation lights came back on, not because the airfield was saved, not because some corporate interest had been protected, but because a simple system that allowed aircraft to find their way home in the dark was working again. She thought about the relief in that small sound, and what it said about the things that actually mattered when things became difficult. She thought about the word museum, which she had used as a weapon without knowing what she was aiming at. It was not a comfortable hour. She was not accustomed to sitting with discomfort that did not have an action attached to it, a problem to solve, a decision to execute. But she sat with it, because she was in a pine-paneled conference room at 11,000 feet, with nowhere to go, and a storm pressing against the windows, and the discomfort was real, and she was, when it came to real things, fundamentally honest. By 6:30, her pilot confirmed that departure was feasible. The runway was clear. The navigation systems were fully operational. The weather window to Aspen was narrow but workable. And if they moved quickly, they had a reasonable chance of making the 9 o'clock meeting. The directors began gathering their things with the energy of people who had survived something and were ready to move forward. Victoria went to find Samuel Reed. He was in the operations room, which was adjacent to the main terminal, seated at a workbench with a cup of coffee and an open maintenance log, entering handwritten notes in a small, precise script, the kind of script that belongs to people who learned to write before keyboards made handwriting optional. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She had all three of her directors with her. She had thought about doing this privately and had decided against it. Some things needed witnesses, not for the drama of it, but because accountability that happens only in private is too easy to unremember and too easy to reframe in the comfortable privacy of one's own narrative. "I want to apologize," she said, "properly, and in front of my team, because they heard what I said and they laughed along with me, and they should hear this too." The three directors stood very still. Samuel set down his pen. "When we landed last night," Victoria continued, "I made a series of comments about your airfield and about your helicopter and about what I assumed you were based on what you were wearing and what you were doing. I was condescending, I was dismissive, and I was thoroughly, completely wrong." She paused. "You saved a medical flight last night. You kept this facility running through a storm that shut down every other option in the region. And you did all of it in an aircraft that I called a museum piece." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry." Samuel Reed was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and held it in both hands the way people do when they are thinking carefully about something. He looked at her with that calm gray gaze that did not seem to carry either warmth or coldness, but simply presents, the look of a person who is fully there, in the room, in the moment, without performance or deflection, or the protective irony that most people deploy in uncomfortable situations. "You're not the first person to underestimate what they're looking at," he said. "You won't be the last." He said it without edge. Not a wound dressed as forgiveness, just an observation stated as fact. "When I was starting out, a long time ago, I used to go to these aerospace industry events, the big ones, the ones where all the money in the room was wearing Italian suits and flying in on aircraft that cost more than most people earn in 10 lifetimes. And I had one decent jacket and boots I'd polished as well as I knew how, and nobody talked to me unless they needed directions to the bar." He paused, looking at the coffee cup. "I learned early that the people who judge by the cover don't usually read very far into the book. But I also learned that sometimes they surprise you. Sometimes people are capable of looking harder when they realize they've been looking wrong. That capacity, the willingness to correct, that's not nothing." He looked at Victoria. "You came and found me in the middle of the night in a snowstorm to say you were sorry. That tells me something." Victoria nodded. There was a tightness in her chest that she recognized as something she didn't usually allow herself to feel at work. The vulnerable compression of having been honestly seen after having behaved badly. The particular discomfort of being given more grace than you feel you have earned. She had spent 11 years building a reputation for being the sharpest, most prepared person in any room she entered. She had earned that reputation honestly, through hard work and genuine intelligence, and a relentless willingness to do the work. But there were rooms, she was understanding now, where the preparation she had done and the intelligence she had cultivated did not actually help her see clearly, rooms where her assumptions moved faster than her judgment, and where the cost of that speed was paid not by her, but by the people she dismissed on her way past them. Samuel Reed had not made her feel small. He had simply shown her something true, and she was large enough, at least, to receive it. She breathed through the tightness in her chest and did not look away. "Thank you for last night," she said. "All of it." Samuel stood and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and dry and unhurried. One of her directors, Marcus, extended his hand as well, and then the other two followed. And there was a quality to those handshakes that was different from the hundreds of transactional handshakes Victoria witnessed every year in boardrooms and hotel lobbies and conference centers, those smooth, professional rituals that mean nothing beyond the closing of an agenda item. These meant something. She could feel that they did. The jet was ready by 7:15. The ground crew had cleared around it and done a pre-departure check, and the pilot confirmed that the window to Aspen was holding, and they needed to move. Victoria stood on the apron in the early morning light, which was pale and still, and carried on it the smell of cold pine and jet exhaust, and the particular freshness that follows a heavy snowfall when the world seems to have been cleaned down to its essential structure, all the soft edges stripped away, and only the hard and the permanent remaining. The mountains around the valley were enormous and white and indifferent. The way mountains are indifferent, not with hostility, but with the simple absence of interest in human distinctions of rank and status and the size of one's aircraft. They had been here before Victoria Lang, and they would be here after every company and acquisition and boardroom she had ever occupied, and they did not know or care what she was worth. Samuel Reed was on the far side of the apron, near the hangar, talking to a member of the ground crew and making notations on a clipboard. He was wearing the same canvas jacket he had worn the night before. The one she had looked at and categorized within the first 5 seconds of seeing him. The way she categorized almost everything efficiently, confidently, and in this case, completely without basis. He had presumably not slept. He would spend this morning managing the aftermath of the storm, the paperwork for the emergency landing, the maintenance checks, the detailed runway inspections, the reporting requirements, the communications with the county and the aviation authority, and the hospital in Steamboat Springs that had received its medical shipment, the 100 ordinary unglamorous tasks that kept a facility operational and safe for the people who depended on it. None of this work would appear in any publication. None of it would be recognized with an award or a profile piece or a speaking invitation at an industry conference. It would simply be done, because it needed to be done, by someone who had decided long ago that the work was the point and the recognition was beside the point. He was not, she noticed, checking to see if she was watching. He was working because the work needed to be done, and it mattered regardless of whether anyone was paying attention to it or crediting him for it. This, she thought, standing in the cold with the morning light beginning to color the eastern snowfields a pale rose and gold, was the thing she had seen in his face when she first dismissed him and mistaken for the absence of something significant. It was not absence. It was the settled confidence of a person whose sense of their own value does not depend on being recognized by people who have just arrived and formed opinions before the wheels stopped rolling. As the jet's engines spooled up and the apron crew moved back to safe distance, Victoria buckled herself in and opened her laptop and found that she did not, for the first moment she could remember in a very long time, immediately begin working. She looked out the window instead. Samuel Reed was still at the hangar. He had set down the clipboard and picked up a broom, a different one from the night before, heavier, with a wider head, designed for moving wet snow rather than dry, and was clearing the threshold of the hangar door with the same measured, unhurried strokes she had first seen when they landed what felt like several lifetimes ago. The jet began to move, taxiing slowly toward the runway, and through the oval window the scene composed itself into something she would carry forward. The old corrugated hangar with its rust-red paint, the old helicopter behind it resting under its tarpaulin in the morning quiet, and Samuel Reed in his faded jacket, working in the aftermath of the storm he had helped everyone survive, doing the next necessary thing with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, without performance, without an audience in mind, without any apparent need for the moment to be witnessed or acknowledged. Then the aircraft turned onto the runway, and the view was gone. replaced by snow-edged tarmac, and the enormous white mountains ahead, and the pale blue gap in the clouds that was their way through to the other side. The meeting in Aspen went well. The acquisition closed by early afternoon. The handshakes in that conference room were smooth and practiced and professionally warm, conducted between people in expensive clothes who spoke the language of leverage and valuation and strategic synergy with the fluency of those who have spoken nothing else for decades. Victoria performed it all with her usual precision. The counter-proposals she had refined through the blizzard night held up exactly as she had hoped, and the other side accepted the key terms with less resistance than her team had projected. She was sharp and prepared and completely in command of the material, and the people across the table from her knew it, and the deal closed cleanly and on favorable terms. By any measure she typically used to evaluate success, the day was a complete one. But she found herself, at several points during the morning, watching the other people in the room, watching the way the executives from the other company looked at the catering staff who moved quietly around the edges of the space, the way her own directors navigated the social architecture of the meeting, the thousand small signals that status-conscious people send each other in professional settings, the small dismissals and rankings and performances of seniority that are so habitual, they are almost invisible, and she saw it all with different eyes. Not softer eyes, sharper ones. Eyes that had been recalibrated by something that had happened in the cold and the dark at 11,000 feet, something that had no place in a corporate agenda but had changed, quietly and permanently, what she saw when she looked at a room. The acquisition was a success. But the lesson of Reed Mountain Airfield was the kind that does not close out at the end of a fiscal quarter. Victoria Lang was a person who learned things and used them that had always been her competitive advantage. The speed and completeness with which she integrated new information and adjusted accordingly. What she had learned on a snow-buried apron in the Colorado mountains was not a strategy or a market insight. It was older than that and more fundamental, and it fit inside a sentence that an old pilot with a worn jacket had offered in the most unremarkable voice imaginable. The paint doesn't have much to do with any of that. She carried it with her on the return flight, which was smooth and bright, the storm completely gone, and the mountains below crisp and white and magnificent in the afternoon sun. She looked at them for a long time. She was thinking about value, what creates it, what signals it, what conceals it, how easily the eye is deceived by surface when it has not been trained to look past what is immediately visible. She was thinking about the photographs on the wall of the Reed Mountain Terminal, all those aircraft spanning a century of mountain aviation, each one labeled in careful handwriting, and the man who had chosen to put them there and what that choice said about the way he understood his place in a longer story. She was thinking about the communities in the valley below the airfield, the 3 small towns that had continued to exist, partly because one man had decided that their access to the wider world was worth preserving, and had spent years and money and labor making that preservation real. She was thinking about the medical transport crew whose aircraft had landed safely on runway 27 because of navigation lights restored by people who knew what they were doing, guided by a helicopter that belonged in a museum. She was thinking about what she had almost missed, and what it would have cost her never to have known it. Not just the personal embarrassment of having been wrong, she had been wrong before and had recovered, but the deeper cost, the slow erosion of a person's ability to see clearly when they spend too long looking at the world only through the lens of what they have already decided matters. That kind of blindness was self-reinforcing. It grew, and she had, for a long time, been feeding it without knowing she was doing so. And somewhere, over the high plains, when her laptop sat open and untouched in front of her, and the light through the window was long and golden, and the earth below was flat and featureless, she took out a notepad paper, not a screen, and wrote a single line, not for any presentation, not for any strategy document, not for any audience at all, just for herself, as a record and a reminder. Arrogance shows us the surface. Wisdom shows us the person. She looked at it for a moment, then closed the notepad and looked back out at the horizon until the mountains were completely gone and the world below became ordinary again. The jet descended through clear air toward home, toward the glass towers and the conference rooms and the acquisition meetings and the life she had built, which was real and substantial and hers. But she would carry something back with her from the mountain that the mountain had not tried to give her and had not needed to. Something that had simply been there, in the cold and the dark and the work, waiting to be seen by anyone who had the presence of mind to look past the paint. The jet descended through clear air, and somewhere far behind her, in the mountains that had already disappeared past the curve of the earth, a man in an old canvas jacket was moving through the last light of the afternoon across a snow-packed apron, doing the work that kept the valley connected to the world, in the aircraft that had kept that valley safe across 31 years of storms and emergencies, and the ordinary quiet work that no one notices until it stops. Patient, capable, entirely unbothered by the opinions of people who had not yet learned how to look. He would be there tomorrow. He would be there the day after. The mountains would stay cold, and the storms would come again, and the work would continue, and the people in the valley below would continue to have what they needed, because one man had decided a long time ago that real things were worth building slowly, and had never once needed anyone to tell him he was right.